Okay, thank you for finding some food and finding a seat, and welcome to tonight's EdTalk and EdCelebrate event. We apparently have dodged the bullet with the winter weather that may or may not ever show up, depending on which forecast you prefer to pay attention to. It's a beautiful night, and it will be a lot of fun. My name is Pat Klein. I'm going to be your MC throughout the evening, so if you hear my voice yakking at you while you're busy with a game or looking at tables or stuff like that, feel free to tune me out if you want to, because I'm just sharing information. But I'm going to take a minute right now. I'm going to introduce my friend Dana Christensen, who's going to come on up and do some introductions for us.
Thank you. Welcome everybody, and it's so nice to finally be having this event again. Good to see you. My name is Dana Christensen, and I had the pleasure of serving on the Ed Foundation board for 6 years. And tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce writer and friend, Michael Tisserand. Yeah, let's give him some applause. Mike is a 1982 graduate of Jefferson Senior High School. Got some 82 members in the house here tonight. And he's been a writer for the last 30 plus years. To talk about Michael's writing career, you have to talk about New Orleans, which has been a huge influence on his writing. How did an Alexandria boy end up in New Orleans? I'm still not quite sure. I've asked Michael a couple times and he's answered, but it's still a bit of a mystery. But Mike settled there as a young man. He fell in love with the culture, and in short order, he was writing about all things New Orleans. He was a longtime editor of Gambit Weekly and Alternative News Weekly. His first book, published in 1996, was Frommer's New Orleans at Night. That must have been a hard book to research. Did you spend a lot of time in the stacks with that one? Yeah. This was followed by The Kingdom of Zydeco in 1997. Mike tells me he's going to be reading some excerpts from that book tonight, so that'll be good. That book won the ASCAP, or ASCAP, Deems Taylor Award for Music Writing. In 2007, he wrote of his experience surviving Hurricane Katrina in Sugarcane Academy, how a New Orleans teacher and his storm-struck students created a school to remember. But the book that received the most accolades was 2016's Crazy, George Harriman, A Life in Black and White. George Harriman was born in New Orleans. He lived his early life there. And some of the honors that that book received: New York Times Notable Book of 2017. It won an Eisner Award for Best Comics-Related Book, and that, of course, is a very prestigious award. It was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Biography, and a finalist for the Penn-Jacqueline Bograd Weld Award for Biography. And Mike, it must have been very gratifying. I know how hard you worked on that book and how long you worked on that book. And then to see it duly recognized by the writing community must have been very gratifying. So it's easy to see the influence that New Orleans has had on Michael's writing career. Recent writing has gone in somewhat of a different direction. Just last year, Mike published My Father When Young, a collection of 1950s photography by his father, Jerry Tisserand. And I think that is my favorite Michael Tisserand book. Yeah. I also understand a children's book is on the way, so we are looking forward to learning more about that. So yes, New Orleans, we see your influence on Michael's writing career, and we are grateful for it. But many of us know that Mike spent his formative years here in Alexandria. He moved here when he was in 7th grade. And I have no doubt that much of what Michael learned here in Alexandria can be found in the pages of his writing, if in a quieter, more understated way. And that's okay, because here in Minnesota, we like quiet and understated. Those of you who heard Michael's talk when he was inducted into the Ed Foundation Hall of Fame a few years ago, heard him recognize and celebrate those teachers, many of whom were in the audience tonight, who had a profound influence on who he is today. It's nice to see some of those teachers here to hear their old student talk. And I would be remiss if I did not recognize Michael's mother, Marilyn. And I wonder if Marilyn can stand for us. Marilyn, you must be very proud, and I must say, you are looking radiant tonight. Alexandria, please join me in welcoming one of your own, award-winning author and journalist, 1982 Jefferson alum, Michael Tisserand.
I'm changing my stories. I'm going to talk about the true story of Dana Christensen for the next 45 minutes. I have receipts. I'm going to start off. I'm going to try. The name of the topic here is for 45 minutes is storytelling. That's what I've been doing in various ways professionally. I got to say it's a little humbling because, in all seriousness, when people ask me who my favorite storytellers are, for the few of you who might not know this, Dana Christensen actually is among the very best, I think, because all of his stories are the opposite of self-aggrandizing. They always end up with Dana looking really foolish at the end of the stories, and that's like, and that's the mark I think of a great storyteller, is you put yourself on the line with those stories. I'm also going to hit about like 5 or 6 of the most contentious, divisive topics in our great national story. So before I do, I thought I should start off with a song. We've been hearing Zydeco music that was playing before, but later on I'm going to talk about how this person sort of started my career inadvertently. His name was Wilson Anthony Buzu, was his nickname, Buzu Chavis, a cowboy, racehorse trainer, farmer, and Zydeco musician from Lake Charles, Louisiana. So I want to just give you like a minute of what a night of Buzu would sound like. So go ahead, please. While we're waiting, that is Buzu there with his Stetson, his apron, kind of a short order cook look, and his diatonic triple row accordion with his family playing alongside him.
Mike in 8th grade would probably start humming.
We'll have one more try and then let's give up on Buzu. And when you all go home, if you promise me that you will go to YouTube and search for, there he is right there. Much better. Johnny Macabre. So Johnny Macabre is Johnny Billy Goat. Macabre is Haitian Creole for Billy Goat, which is a big influence on the language there. French, Haitian Creole, and English is what he sings in. So we're going to set up under my little PowerPoint here. But while I do, I want to thank Mr. Anderson and Mr. Benson. I had the most amazing junior high art experience. It was really stunning. Pottery, photography, animation. With Mr. Anderson, I made a Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter political cartoon during that campaign. And Mr. Kranzler, Harvey Kranzler, who in 7th grade, Dana was in my class. We were in Mr. Kranzler's class together. And Dana somehow remembers and often tells the story that I was hiding in the cupboards when Mr. Kranzler came in and said, "Where's Michael Tisserand?" And I jumped out. I don't know why. So, is it good to go? Yeah. One thing about teachers I know is that the littlest comments that are made, even sort of in passing, can stick with you. And there's many, many lines that I remember from my time in Central Junior High School and Jefferson High School. And when I was getting ready for this talk, what I remembered one time was after doing a play in high school, Tom Fleming was the director. And he got up and sort of talked to us afterwards. It was Flowers for Algernon was the play. And he thanked us all, and he said this line, he said, "At a time when you all are learning who you are, you took the time to learn who these characters are as well." And that line stuck with me really, really hard. And that sort of has become what my career has been, is, you know, all these stories that I'm going to share with you are the ways that I kind of figured out who I was and what I wanted to tell. That's Crazy Cat, by the way. We'll get to Crazy Cat in a second. There's Buzu. Oh my gosh, I'm starting off with that. So I'm going to start off. In Alexandria, we all know about storytelling, and we know what happens when the world doesn't necessarily believe our story. By the way, I speak not as a New Orleanian, but as a future Alexandrian. Dana did leave off that I'm moving back to Alexandria in the next couple weeks. So thank you, Shelley. But I want to talk about the kinds of stories that I like to write, and also maybe give some ideas on the kinds of stories that can help us in very difficult times. Because as we know, there is a very troublesome war going on across the world, and it feels very close to us right now. And the state of our national stories is kind of, we're not really on the same page right now. Whether it's, you know, of course, the runestone there. Well, first of all, I got to say, as a past and future Alexandrian, yes, I am a runestone believer, and I would never, ever, ever admit to being anything else. But if I had doubts, I would say that the fact that this man, Olaf Oman, set out to create this runestone is actually even a better story than the story about the Vikings showing up early. Because really, being first someplace, you know, that's one thing, but to set out and make a stone like that and spend your life committed to that project is really something. But it is, you know, it does lead Alexandria to claim the mantle of birthplace of America, and this kind of leads to my next 10 minutes or so, where I'm going to talk about the stories that we are not agreeing on as a country. These are the stories that are making and breaking school board races, that are dividing people on what network they watch on television to get their news, that are keeping people who love each other from enjoying Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner together sometimes. We're telling stories around each other and over each other, but not really to each other. The birthplace of America, you know, is one story. The story of the largest, you know, I know many of us know, the largest mass execution in history in Mankato of the Dakota people who rebelled against having their land taken from the birthplace of America. Something as simple as Santa Claus, right? One of our great primary stories is something even to fight about in these days. Here's Santa Claus as drawn by Thomas Nast, the 19th century cartoonist, who took St. Nicholas the image of St. Nicholas, and then Thomas More, or C. Clement More, had written The Night Before Christmas and All Through the House, Not a Creature Was Stirring, Not Even a Mouse, had written that story in the early 1800s. Thomas Nast gave an image. He drew the first Santa Claus, creating it from St. Nicholas for Harper's Weekly. During the Civil War, there's Santa Claus dressed, you can see it, but this is the first image of Santa Claus that Thomas Nast drew. As a Union spirit, he's actually giving a gift of Jefferson Davis being hung, a little puppet of Jefferson Davis being hung to Union soldiers. So it's not like we haven't been fighting about Santa Claus for a long time, and we're still fighting about Santa Claus, as we know from is Santa Claus white or is Santa Claus black? Just to pause for a second, like that has actually been a discussion. Is Santa Claus white or is Santa Claus black? I know where I fall on it. This is Fred Parker in New Orleans, and that's my daughter Cecilia. Fred is Santa Claus. He died 2 years ago and was just an amazing fellow. He was Santa Claus for about 50 years in his neighborhood, and every New Orleans kid went to his house, and he had, if the twinkle of the eye defined Santa Claus, that was Santa Claus. My favorite movie as a child. I love this movie. I had the soundtrack. Mom can remember that. I had that 45 where you drop the needle and you read the story and you turn the 45 and it plays the songs. Zippity Doo Dah. I did not know when I saw it, when it had its reissue in the 1970s, that the NAACP had protested it when it came out. It was controversial from the very start, and now that is the movie that Disney tends not to show because it told a story of a man who certainly was a formerly enslaved individual being very happy on the plantation instead of the story that's told at the Centerpiece of Justice. I took this photo there. It's called the Lynching Memorial in southern Alabama. All those stones represent counties in the United States where lynchings took place, from Orleans Parish in New Orleans to Duluth, Minnesota, to tell a very different story. That's one of the stories that I tried to tell. This is an illustration that went with an article I wrote for the New York Times. I'm sure some of you might have heard of it, but it did get a fair amount of news when a few Confederate monuments started coming down in New Orleans. Just one second. There it is. So this is a story that I told about the storytelling that goes on in these monuments. In the late 1980s, when I was visiting New Orleans, the city I now call home, I stopped at a neighborhood drugstore and met a charming and talkative pharmacist. As he rung up my purchase, he placed a thin newspaper in my bag. "You might like to read this," he said. Later, I opened the bag and saw the Journal of the National Association for the Advancement of White People, filled with stories lauding the organization's founder, David Duke. I recall the initial shock, but also a sense of recognition. It was just one of the countless just between us exchanges that had already been offered in my lifetime. A white-on-white, just between us moment might take the form of a pointed comment or just a knowing glance, once it came to me in the middle of a handshake. They are not limited to the South, but I've come to know them well in the 30 years that I've lived in New Orleans. Here we live amid just between us monuments to the Confederacy. These include towering statues of Jefferson Davis and Generals Robert E. Lee and P.G.T. Beauregard, as well as an obelisk celebrating a white militia that rioted against integrated police forces in 1874. Over time, these tributes to white supremacy have become just part of the landscape. I never even noticed them, white friends have told me, and often I could say the same. As I drive these streets, I'm reminded of the observations of Chuck Berry, who celebrated the city in his songs, but shrewdly wrote in his autobiography that in New Orleans, segregation was practiced in a more polite manner, with some strategy. Monuments are coming down as they must, but breaking the just between us contract will require its own strategy of turning down the offer however and whenever it is made. I greatly regret not going back to the drugstore to throw my copy of the white supremacist newspaper back on the counter. Instead, I have it on a box with other souvenirs of the just between us moments. A friend of mine, Art Spiegelman, wrote this book, Mouse. It's a beautiful graphic novel about his father, who was a survivor of the Holocaust, a survivor of Auschwitz, and his mother, who also was a survivor of the Holocaust. I highly recommend it. It is taught in some schools. My son read it in middle school. It was taken off the curriculum just a couple months ago in Tennessee because of this scene, or this is one of the scenes why. Because this place in Tennessee does indeed teach that the Holocaust happened. They're not denying the Holocaust happened. But it was a couple passages in Art's book, including this one, which after Art Spiegelman, who draws himself and other Jews in the book as mice and draws the Nazis as cats, is talking to his father. Art's mother had killed herself, and he found out that his father had destroyed all of her diaries. Did you ever read any of them? Art said. Can you remember what she wrote? No, I looked in, but I don't remember. Only I know that she said, I wish my son, when he grows up, he will be interested by this. So Art loses it, and he curses out his father and calls him a murderer. His father, who survived Auschwitz, he calls a murderer. This was brought up in the minutes of the school board meeting in the McMinn County of Tennessee by Michael Cochran there talking. I thought the end was stupid, to be honest with you. A lot of the cussing had to do with the son cussing out the father, so I don't really know how that teaches our kids any kind of ethical stuff. It's just the opposite. Instead of treating his father with some kind of respect, he treated his father like he was the victim. We don't need this stuff to teach kids history. Which is, of course, the point of Art Spiegelman's book, that the Holocaust seeps in generation after generation after generation. And we will be fighting each other over some of these. And then bringing it right up to date, good old COVID, good old masking and anti-maskers. I am not here to laud either side of this debate, which is still surrounding us in this room now, except to say that, boy, arguing the science just doesn't get anywhere, does it? I mean, saying that, because those people who are not approving of the CDC masking requirements quite arguably say that things that have been accepted as scientific fact are no longer accepted as scientific fact. Science does change, so they are correct in saying that. But here is my point of why I throw this photo up here. It's the story that we can maybe start to talk about with each other, not the science. Everybody has a New York Times or Washington Post article or a blog post or a podcast or a YouTube channel they can turn to if they want to argue the science. The question is, who are we? Like, what's the story we tell about ourselves? What the story that becomes us. So this is one part of who we are. Gary Cooper in High Noon, a sole individual standing up for what he believes is right, even when the crowd, tells him that he is wrong. This is another part of who we are. Food rations, in World War II, sacrificing what we want for the common good. Those are two American stories that seem to be colliding right now in some way. And maybe if we approach it on the story level and not on the data level, we might be able to start to merge our two stories together again. Maybe. But I promised I would get back to Buzu. So here is my story about Buzu Chavis. This was the first story that I ever wrote when I figured out this is what I wanted to do. A magazine in New Orleans sent me out to Lake Charles to interview Buzu Chavis. And I showed up, and I'll write about what I encountered. But first let me tell you who I was. I've written 2 or 3 articles at that time, and I thought I would go interview him and hear a story about becoming a musician, and that would be that. I get there, and the farm that he lives on is exploding. He's like, well, I've got this going on, this going on, this going on. So why don't I take care of that, sit down and wait for me, and I will come back and we'll do the interview. And I said, wait, I grew up all surrounded by farms. I can help you. I can go, hop in the pickup truck with you and go get the hay bales and pull them out of the barn. I can do that. I know how to do this. I'm from a little town in Minnesota. I knew about that. Friends, let me tell you, this was me in high school. I was voted preppiest dresser. I would overdress for math class in grape tweed and a pink Oxford Claus shirt. One of the things I look back on and actually deeply regret is I was not curious. There was the family farm crisis in 1982 when we graduated, as many people in this room knew, but I did not at the time. I was not curious to know what the members of the Future Farmers of America, what their stories were at that time. It really took me to get to Buzu Chavis's house, the first French Creole-speaking person's house I ever went to, the first black person's house I ever went to, and the first farmer's house I ever went to. So I never told Buzu that I kind of lied about my farm experience, but I've often thought back on how going to Lake Charles helped bring me back to this area and realize some of the stories that I had missed as I was trying to develop my own story of a guy, sailing off for better climes. Here's a scene from Buzu Chavis's farm in Lake Charles. Leona Chavis looks through the kitchen window as a line of trucks pulls up to her house and watches as chaos erupts in her front yard. Her sons climb out the trucks, hollering instructions at each other as they unlatch horse trailers, hoofs land on hard ground, dogs bark, a rooster and turkey noisily battle each other for the rooftop of a chicken coop. She sighs, Buzu, he's just like his mom, she says, turning from the window to the stove. If she wanted something done, you're always gonna get it done. The phone rings. He's always into something. I don't care what it is, she adds, waving the receiver in the air as she talks. I'm going over here, Leona. I'm getting ready to come back over there. Hey, Leona, I'm going over there. I'll be back. Just like that. Boom, boom. Welcome to Dog Hill, a slightly elevated 1-acre farm of horses, dogs, guinea fowl, chickens, ducks, turkeys, and calves. Located just outside the city limits of Lake Charles in a dusty network of winding roads and small farms. It got its name when city dwellers began coming here to dump their pets, but it gained fame as the subject of a Buzu Chavis song. Thanks to Chavis's music, this farmland is his own Noah's Ark. Here are the dogs of Dog Hill, the goats of Johnny Billy Goat, the donkeys of Zydeco Hee Haw, and the horses of Buzu's Baby. Because of Chavis's great influence on modern Zydeco as menagerie has multiplied, all young bands today can be heard barking and braying in musical imitation of a Dog Hill morning. But on this summer morning, Dog Hill is in an uproar. The nearby Delta Dons racetrack has closed for the season and the new barn isn't ready for 9 incoming racehorses. Clearly, interviews with visiting riders, scheduled or not, will have to wait. Leona Chavis sends me through the kitchen door to find her husband. I follow the sound of shouting coming from the half-finished barn. Inside is Buzu Chavis, dressed in a brown work pants and a plaid western shirt, stamping through sawdust through a barn stall. Look, Chavis bellows, waving a Stetson at a carpenter. I'm the racehorse. He aims his mouth at a mess of exposed wires and lunges his head over the gate. I'm the racehorse, he repeats. The carpenter, with an uneasy smile, says he doesn't think the horse is going to reach the wires. Chavis glares at him. I'm 65. I know what I'm doing. I guess your trip to Washington, the carpenter drawls, didn't help your disposition none. Chavis stops in his tracks. Yes, he's just returned from Washington, D.C., where he stood before 100,000 people as part of a 4th of July show. But when he's standing on a shag carpet of hay and sawdust and staring at a string of loose wires, he doesn't want to hear a line like that. He slams the gate, puts his hat back on, hurries through the barn. He's a good carpenter, he mutters as he passes. He don't know horses. Chavis's problems are just beginning. Outside, his sons have hitched the horses to an arm of a metal walker that is supposed to keep them pacing in a circle. The walker isn't turning, the horses are starting to jump around nervously. The sight of 9 expensive horses tied to a metal tree, kicking their hind legs in every direction, is alarming. One of those kicks lands, it's $1,000 or more, says Leona Chavis, who has rushed from the kitchen and is balancing on a wood plank in a field of mud, trying to calm the animal. What makes matters worse for Buzu is he has the use of only his right hand, and he's left-handed. A couple months before, he was hooking a heavy barbecue pit to a trailer hitch, and it crashed down, tearing the flesh from 2 fingers. His wife drove him to the hospital, recalls Leona. All the way he was saying, all the other musicians, they've been gunning after me. They done got my hand, now they're gonna be shooting at the other hand. The fingertips were amputated, the top joint, and he played a dance that weekend in great pain. Working with horses is even harder. The morning passes and the barn slowly gets finished. At the noontime heat settles over Dog Hill. Buzu is storming, boom boom, from one end of the farm to another. He checks on his wife and the harnessed horses, under control. He checks on the visiting writer, who has found himself cutting wires and hanging box fans in the barn. He goes back to the carpenter. He's covering the wires. Leona Chavis returns to the kitchen, where she starts making preparations for a Dog Hill Labor Day festival that she and her husband throw every year. She's also watching a soap opera and cooking an incredible multi-course lunch of beef and squirrel stew, gumbo, and greens. Then, boom boom, Chavis strides in, followed by his sons Relis and Charles, and the kitchen suddenly comes alive with activity. The phone rings, the screen door opens and slams, and family members file through the house, dipping spoons into pots, standing around the table with bowls of food. Chavis isn't eating, he skipped breakfast and doesn't take time for lunch. He sits down at the table, his eyes darting across the room. Sometimes a lot of people come to interview me and I get so furious, he begins. I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about these other guys. And then he starts his story. So that was the point really where I realized the kind of story I wanted to tell was a story where you think you know what's going on, you think the plot is settled, kind of like Columbo for the oldest people here. There is no whodunit in Columbo. You get the story in the first 15 minutes. The next 45 minutes is just understanding what the story means. And that's kind of the story that I want to tell. That includes a friend of ours, Daryl Purpose, a good friend of my mom's, and a friend of Dana's, actually. Dana met Daryl Purpose a few times. I'm just going to read about 4 or 5 paragraphs from my time with Daryl Purpose, who, on the left, was his time as a professional blackjack player. He's a card counter. On the right, he's much happier as a folk singer. I knew him during both times of his life. And he was going to do, he's going to play in Biloxi, Mississippi, going to go count cards there. And one thing that card counters did, at least the team that he worked with, is they would hire somebody to come in as a quote-unquote big player. And that way, that person would actually make the big bets to earn the money, and Daryl would be making really small bets sitting at the other side of the table, sending me, because it would become me, little hand signals on what to bet. That way, if I got caught, no big deal. If I get barred from the casino, that's not a problem, because I'm not really part of the team. I'm just going to read about 5 paragraphs here. I know what you're doing, the motel manager shouts. I know what you're doing. His yells rise above an ugly beachfront hotel on the fringe of Biloxi, Mississippi, a few miles from the city's casino strip. It's late Friday afternoon. We're about to get thrown out of our room. What are you talking about? Daryl asks, acting innocent. He follows the manager, a thin, older man who at the moment is carrying an armful of clean sheets from room to room. Would you stop and tell me what you're talking about? Daryl says. Daryl is captain of a 3-man team of professional blackjack players who count cards for a living. He arrived in Biloxi the night before, driving a rented car with a suitcase in the trunk, packed with $28,000 in cash, all in hundreds. The commotion wakes John, a professional player who, like Daryl, has been counting cards for 15 years. John has prematurely gray hair and a 4-month losing streak that surrounds him in a cloud of defeat. Our third player, Adis, walks sleepily out of the back room, a thin, long-haired Lithuanian immigrant who's learning to play blackjack to supplement his career as a photographer. Daryl returns to the room and starts packing. We have to go. I think the manager's listening to our phone calls. It becomes clear the manager grew suspicious when he looked in our room and saw stacks of bills and purple $500 chips. No one with that kind of money stays in a dump like that. A room of pale vampires or drug dealers sleeping all day with the curtains drawn, then going out at night? Not in his hotel. So that's the story of Daryl, and here's the Columbo moment. I have a great time with Daryl. I'm enjoying myself. My wife actually goes to the mall and dresses up with a heavy makeup and becomes a babe sort of sitting on my right so I don't draw more suspicious. And I'm playing $500 bets. I have a $2,000 wager that I split at one point. Everyone's gathered around me. I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm only doing what Daryl tells me to do with his hand signals. I don't know how to play blackjack, but I'm doing exactly what he tells me to do. At one point, somebody spills a drink down my back, and because I am such a big player, the cocktail waitress stands me up, takes my jacket off, and towels off my back. It was very exciting. I'm not embarrassed. I'm a rich, reckless, chip-tossing Jay Gatsby with all the friends in the world. I throw a chip at the waitress's tray, not looking at Daryl as I ignore his rule about tipping. When I finally push off from the table, I've won more than $11,000. The casino gives me a container for my chips, and the pit boss tells me to let him know if there's anything he can do for me. Daryl recognizes my excitement, but he doesn't share it. He's lost count of how much money he's gambled in his life. He believes his biggest win, $130,000 during an hour and a half in Atlantic City, set a record for the most sizable earnings enjoyed by a professional counter in one sitting. But who can he tell? I'm one of the best blackjack players in the world, but I can't believe I put all that energy into something, and it's blackjack. I used to love it. I put a lot of work into meeting the right people. I was just a lot younger, you know? Just 20 years old, no life, nothing to lose. That's why I didn't feel like gambling at all. So that was kind of my Columbo moment. That this story, this exciting story of blackjack that was, riveting to me, was about people in the middle stage of their careers having second thoughts about what they chose to do, and that idea that when you're young, it's just your life, so it doesn't feel like a gamble. I'm going to briefly go talk about George Harriman. Dana mentioned that. There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you, as said Maya Angelou. George Harriman was a cartoonist born in New Orleans to mixed-race parents during the time that those monuments I talked about were going up to celebrate the Confederate monuments. But George Harriman's family was on a very different side of that battle. And as things got worse and worse, they were light-skinned enough that George's father moved them to Los Angeles and they passed as white. So from a very early stage, George had this sense, here he is here as a young man and as an older man, that identity, who you are, what color skin you have, even your gender, is something that is possibly something that is very much in flux and depends on society and history for defining. Here's sort of a famous strip he did. And by the way, he passed as white, he stayed white, he identified as white for the rest of his life and married a white woman and worked in places that a black person could not work at that time, including William Hearst newspaper. Not so nice, Crazy said. What is it? Says Ignatz the Mouse. My face. Well, I've known that for a long time. Why didn't you tell me, says Crazy. Tell you what? That I have an inferiority complexion. It's really amazing that George Harriman, just like Art Spiegelman, who is a big fan of George Harriman's, found a way in stories about mice and cat to tell stories about what was inside him that he could not actually say out loud. I noticed, Crazy, that sometimes you're a miss and sometimes you're a mystery. Yes, Ignatz, so am I. So I am, says Crazy, because Crazy is actually black and white, male and female. So this brings me up to my latest model of storytelling, and I found this in the least predicted place, which is in a box of things that my dad, who passed away several years ago, had left, and I had never gone through until the pandemic happened. And found out that for a brief period of his time, in his 20s, he set out with a camera in European capitals to tell stories about, this guy reminds me of that blackjack player in a way. He seems like a salesman being surrounded by more modern people than he is, perhaps, thinking about himself and how he landed there. But he set out to tell these stories as a journalist with a camera, and then came back to his home in southern Indiana and was a journalist at his own parties and told stories such as this New Year's Eve. There is so much going on here that you can just imagine. Or this one, for example, which is the cover of the book, My Father When Young. And then in 1959, he even went down to Mardi Gras, and that guy never even told me about it. That was his little secret he went to the grave with, and took these amazing photographs. Look at that girl in the majorette uniform, quite likely the only sober person in this picture. And even really remarkably, he documented gay carnival in 1959 in New Orleans. I've shared this with gay historians and historians of gay culture in New Orleans, and these are very, very unusual. Within 2 years, these celebrants would be busted. The Jefferson Parish Police raided a gay carnival club's party and published the names of all the people who were there, many who were closeted, many who had families, published their names in the local paper. So my dad, very unwittingly, because art, of course, transcends the artist, very unwittingly documented moments of courage and laughter without really fully, I think, being aware of what he did. He also went to Yugoslavian President Marshal Tito's parade in Paris, and what I really loved is not just that he took this picture of Marshal Tito, but he kind of traveled around and once again took pictures of lone sentry guards and passersby, such as this woman in the red hat. And that's, when I worked as an editor at the newspapers, what I would say all the time is trying not to tell the big story, but see what the little stories are around the big story. I'm going to go back to the very beginning of the talk, the big stories of our time that we are in such contention over. The story of how best to respond to a pandemic. The story of how to reckon with our nation's past, either vis-a-vis the American Indian populations that lived here before we did, or the enslaved people that built so much of our wealth in the South and also in the North. How do we reckon with that? As we know, school board races and presidencies are won and lost on these kind of topics. And if you think I'm going to give you the answer out of it, the Alexandria Area Education Foundation will refund you $25, but I will not. But I will say that if we are meeting our loved ones over dinner and we are fighting about what somebody saw on Rachel Maddow or somebody saw on Sean Hannity, and that is our topic, maybe we're not looking at the food enough. Maybe we're not looking at, well, something like this. So friends of my mom know what this is. This is Phefernus, German for pepper nut. And just in recent years, I think maybe because of the pandemic, I've been trying to dive deeper and deeper into my family's own stories. And you know, we come from a German family, and this is probably the only German thing that we have kept. And I am trying really hard to find anybody else who makes Phefernus the way we make Phefernus, and I've yet to find that person. This Phefernus, you know, we are the stories that we tell, we're also the little German cookies that we eat. There we are making some Phefernus a few years back. But when you get to the Phefernus in our family, there are stories after stories about the fact that the Phefernus requires goose grease. And finding the goose grease, you know, first of all, you have to do it the year before, because good luck finding a goose when you want to make the Phefernus in early November. Or there's the time that a friend showed up because mom was looking for a goose, and we find out there was a live goose brought to the basement, you know, quacking around. The other thing about the Phefernus is it is really, 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 really difficult to make. The dough gets very, very stiff, and you can't make it from the recipe because the only recipe we have calls for a nickel's worth of anise. So the recipe is all up here, and especially my mom's head. And we all know what this is. This is a cribbage board. Once again, something that I find myself wanting to dive deeper and deeper and ask stories where I find them. And if you are looking for stories in your own family, there is a writer I'm going to get to in a second named Anton Chekhov, who famously said, you know, don't tell me about the moonlight. Tell me about the way the shards of glass look when they glisten. You know, so maybe don't try to ask about your family. Ask about that object there on top of that table, and what's that story? So I learned to play cribbage on this cribbage board, and just in the recent year when we've been playing cribbage, I've been asking mom stories about it. So I find out that Frank Hartman, my Great Northern engineer grandfather, made this with a guy named Charlie Gardner, who lived down the road in St. Cloud, and Frank Hartman would go down to Charlie Gardner's. And I found Charlie Gardner in the census and started looking him up and things like that. Charlie Gardner was dirt poor. Literally, the detail that my mom remembers is that he had a dirt floor. So this cribbage board is a story of a guy, you know, with a dirt floor that could make a beautiful piece of gameware such as this. I asked my mom one time, and I hope it's okay if I tell this story. But I said, you know, because my mom used to play with Frank Hartman, the maker of this board, and I said, did you ever did anybody in your family ever let each other win? She said, one time. One time she let my grandfather win, her father win, and that was in the hospital, the last game they played together. So, look to your cribbage boards, look to that cookie that's in the recipe book, and I think if we get to those stories over and over again, we're not going to solve the big stories that have us yelling at each other from across the table, or maybe going into separate rooms, but it might start a different kind of conversation. We might find that Gary Cooper, you know, and the war ration stories, you know, can exist on the same page. I'm going to end with my favorite storyteller, this guy, Anton Chekhov. This is a, Dana printed this out for me, but he didn't paperclip it. So Anton Chekhov was a doctor in the late 19th and early 20th century in Russia. He actually wrote maybe his best story visiting Ukraine and called The Steppe, a really beautiful evocation of the beauty of Ukraine. His family was impoverished, so he worked himself through college and medical school and raised money for his family by writing short stories and selling them to magazines. And those stories became the foundation for so much, you know, Ernest Hemingway and so many others, you know, consider Chekhov a big influence. And his plays, The Seagull and The Cherry Orchard, led to a naturalistic kind of acting, which led to the method acting. So Chekhov kind of goes right to Marlon Brando, you know, and changed theater and acting in movies. But Lewis Simpson wrote this poem about Chekhov, and why bring it up now? And it's based on a true story, and I'm just going to read this poem. Once some people were visiting Chekhov. While they made remarks about his genius, the master fidgeted. Finally, he said, "Do you like chocolates?" They were astonished and silent. He repeated the question, whereupon one lady plucked up her courage and murmured shyly, "Yes." "Tell me," he said, leaning forward, light glinting from his spectacles. "What kind? The light sweet chocolate or the dark bitter kind?" The conversation became general. They spoke of cherry centers, of almonds and Brazil nuts. Losing their inhibitions, they interrupted one another, for people may not know what they think about politics in the Balkans, or the vexed question of men and women, that everyone has a definite opinion about the flavor of shredded coconut. Finally, someone spoke of chocolates filled with liqueur, and everyone, even the author of Uncle Vanya, was at a loss for words. As they were leaving, he stood by the door and took their hands. In the coach returning to St. Petersburg, they agreed it had been a most unusual conversation. So that's what I wish for you, is many, many, many unusual conversations, whether it's about Phefernus or chocolates or what that cribbage board is, or anything else in your family's hutch or table. While the larger stories rage around us, we might find ourselves building a fortress of these stories that help build us back together again. Thank you all. Now don't leave here saying he doesn't believe in the rune stone.
Excellent job. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you. One more time, let's have a round of applause. That was amazing, and nothing short. And I think the messages that you shared are so true and so intentional and important in this time that we're in. of crazy big stories that are incredibly hard to wrap our minds around and our arms around and our personalities around, and really focusing on the small random stories about things at home and with our families and with each other is so incredibly important, and I'm glad that I got to hear that this evening, and I hope that you all are as well. A couple of the... Absolutely. So thank you again.